Welcome to the second part of looking at Adobe Camera Raw. If you've only just joined us, I'll take you through to how to open the image. We've already dropped it into Photoshop CC and filter, and then the Camera Raw filter. If you've missed the previous video, we've already gone over the basics, and we're going to have a quick look at the tone curve. There's two ways of dealing with the tone curve. There's parametric and point. The parametric, you simply use your sliders and it will change the parts of the curve. If we turn our clipping mask on, it's a little bit easier to see what it's doing. So if we move the highlights, it's either darkening down the highlights or lightening them. And the lights, it's the middle section of the image towards the upper. And obviously as you continue down, darks, and then finally your blacks. And if you really need to, you can actually change the point that those pieces take effect. So you can drag that line down and increase the contrast in the blacks. Obviously, to resort back to our old version, Control Alt and Z will back us up and reverse, or you can type in zeros. I actually prefer the point version, and you can simply grab a point on the curve and increase or decrease the brightness if you've only got one single point. If you select a point in the middle and then grab the top, you can increase that S-curve, which increases the overall contrast. If I crank that all the way up and turn off the clipping mask, you can see what it's doing. It's blowing out the highlights big time and upping the contrast. And you've got a lot of fine-tuning and control that you can use there. So quite a useful tool if you want to darken just your highlights, just your shadows down, and drag this bottom piece of the image down. Obviously, if you turn your clipping mask on, it'll give you a warning when your image is actually slowly becoming underexposed. And if you drag up your shadows, then you'll notice how they start becoming a muddy grey. Generally not something you'd want to do. However, it is useful if you're wanting to get really creative with them. There's what's called a Sabatter effect, or solarization, which you used to be able to do in the darkroom. You still can do it in the darkroom if you can find the equipment and chemicals. You half expose your image, start developing it in the chemicals, and then expose it to light again, and it has this effect that inverts the image and can end up quite surreal. Not something I generally recommend that you do, but can be quite fun to go and play with, especially if you're wanting to get creative with your images. So our next step is details. Now I'll actually cancel out of this image because, as you can see, there's very little noise in the image because it's obviously been taken well. However, here's one I prepared earlier, and this version of the image has an awful lot of noise in it, and so we're going to do the same thing, and filter, Camera Raw filter. We're going to see how the system gets rid of our noise. So it's our third tab across, and as you increase the luminance slider, you'll see some of that noise vanish. But you'll notice that some of the colour variation is still there, so you can increase the color slider and eventually it will get rid of most of the noise. You'll notice that sometimes you start getting these weird lines and things happening, and that's where the computer's recognizing patterns that aren't necessarily there. So most people want to try and take their images in low ISO, so you're not trying to get rid of this noise to start with. What you'll find, particularly with some cameras, is you'll get vertical lines appearing as you reduce the noise, which is not fantastic, but getting an image and actually managing to record it in some situations is better than missing the shot or having it totally blurred. And each image will be slightly different as to how much luminance or color reduction you need and how much detail you want to keep. In this case, we can drop the luminance detail down. It softens the skin tone off a little bit. If you soften it too much, then you start losing contrast and the image can end up quite muddy. So it's one of those things where compromise is key, and you have to make that call as to have you got enough detail in your image, or have you got too much noise, and which way do you go on that. So we'll click OK. You can see how much detail that noise has sucked out of it, and it's flattened a lot of that out of the image, which is quite unfortunate, but at least gives you an idea as to what noise reduction can do, and also why you don't want the noise in the first place. Okay, we've gone back to our original image, and we're on our fourth tab across, and this is the HSL, or hue, saturation and luminance, and also what grayscale, which is for converting to black and white. So let's go over the luminance for starters. Luminance is how bright your image is, and in this case you can actually change how bright your reds are or how dark they are. Same thing with the oranges, and the same thing with the yellows and the greens, and all the way and so on and so forth. Now that gives you a huge amount of control, and you can go overboard with them, but particularly if you've got a sky that isn't a particularly rich blue and you want to make it a much richer blue, then a brighter blue, you can increase the luminance. If you want to make it a richer blue, grab your saturation and you can increase the color saturation of the blues or the reds. And something that people for some reason seem to like doing is selective color. It has its place generally in competitions and things it's frowned upon. And let's zoom in. So we've just left the blues and turned pretty much everything else to grey. As I say, it has its place, but yeah, be warned. if you put it into a competition, you could well get yeah, stood on. And this is going to bring us to our hue, and this allows you to change that hue. So that blue we can actually shift to the aqua all the way through to the purple. And as I say, you have a huge amount of room to play. We'll shift all these back to 100 and show you a couple of what happens to a couple of other colors when we start playing with that hue. We'll move our reds, and you can move them to the magentas or back to the orange. And so yeah, you can get quite creative with those. For those of you doing 106, you may find some of those come in handy when you're tasked to do week 3. Now, having said that, when you get to the week that you're doing your grayscale or black and whites, this set of sliders comes in very, very useful. In the olden days, you used to have to put a filter, colour piece of glass in front of your camera, so that when you took a photo, all the reds would either be made darker or lighter. In this case, if you use a red filter, a red piece of glass, all your greens will turn to black, and your reds will be much brighter. But in this day and age, you take it into colour and you can do the inversion. And there's a couple of nice little tricks in here. We'll set it to default, so we're back to 0. But watch what happens to the reds, and particularly on the skin tone. If you darken the reds down, you end up with a lot of noise on the skin. If you brighten your reds up, you can end up softening the skin out. So if you've got somebody who's got very red cheeks, like me, and you don't want those cheeks to actually show up in a black and white image, then you can actually brighten those reds, and it will reduce the butterflies on cheeks. Having said that, if you've got an old person and you want to emphasize their skin color, then you can do exactly the opposite and drag those reds and oranges back down, and it will increase the contrast within the skin. What else can you do? Well, you've got your greens, and again you can make them brighter or darker, and that basically, if you're working through a landscape, you can deliberately draw attention to parts of the image. Now, having said that, if you darken down one part too much, in this case I've darkened the yellows of the bananas, not only can you end up with things looking really strange, you can get quite a lot of noise around it. To reduce that, if you reduce the colour next door, then it will generally reduce the amount of noise that you're getting. If you put them at opposite ends of the spectrum, then you tend to increase the amount of noise. So yeah, again, be careful. And oh my giddy aunt, I'm sorry for that poor lady. I'll undo that. So yeah, you've got a lot of creative freedom with a black and white, an awful lot more than you used to have in the olden darkroom days. But going on from black and white, we'll go into this next bar here, which is called split toning. So we've converted our image black and white. There's no colour in it, but if we want to put some colour back in, you can pick a hue and gradually increase it back into the image. Now obviously we're putting the colour back into the highlights here. If we want to put the colours in the shadows, you can bring the colours up into the shadows, and the centre bar allows you to change the balance between the color in the highlights versus the color in the shadows. And what you'll find is you can either use complementary colors, or you can go with a monochromatic or an analogous color scheme. So for those of you who don't remember your 108, the monochromatic, we'd be sticking with the same color. So let's go with pretty close to the same hue. There we go. And you can change the level of saturation between the highlights and the shadows. If we go with a complementary, that's where we were pretty much. Your blues complementary to your yellow, or you can go with an analogous, so that is picking a shade that's similar. So we'll go with an orange and a yellow. Actually, that's a little bit on the green side, so let's bring it across. And yeah, you can just keep fiddling until you're happy with the colours that you've gone for. Yeah, it's kind of got an olden feel to it, and almost a sepia tone. So yeah, lots and lots of ability to change and play with those. And you can actually see the effect quite nicely in the gradient there, especially if we change back to our blues. You can see how the hue and we'll pull the saturation right up so you can really see it. You can see how the yellows and oranges are here, and you've got your blues in here, and you can see how the shift happens as we change the balance as well. So yeah, very, very powerful. Entirely a matter of taste, and something that takes a little bit of playing with. Remember what you're trying to do, particularly if you're editing images. You're wanting to add to the image, so why would you be putting that split tone in? If you're going for an olden feel, then going for that sepia tone will work quite nicely. And for something quite poppy and out there, or even alien, then maybe the greens, but they tend to let's just say that's a little bit of overkill, and you've got to use a certain degree of taste before you choose to stick to it. So yeah, like anything with Photoshop, just because it's there doesn't mean that you should use it. But hey, by all means use it, have fun, play with it, and then pull it back and see whether or not you should actually be using it. Speaking of which, let's leave that there for a second, and I'll show you what happens when we go and convert it back to color. And see that color of that the split toning actually still sits there. So if you've got highlights that are a really unusual color and you're wanting to balance just the highlight colors, then you can actually use your split toning to play with that. It tends not to be an issue, but it can be useful if you really get stuck on your colors. Let's drag that all back to something resembling normality, and we're going to have a quick look at lens correction. This is going to be a quick look because this image isn't going to do a huge amount for showing you, but I'll show you a couple of the tools. Two types of distortion. So if your original image is bulging out, you can bring it back in. So that's what we would call barrel distortion, and you can fix that. And the opposite is pincushion. And you've also got vertical and horizontal distortion. So if your buildings are leaning back away from you, you can actually tip them back up and make them upright. And if your horizon is not square, then you can tilt and fix that as well. Particularly important when you've got water horizons, because the human eye does not expect our water to be running off the edge of the page. And lastly, there's a vignette effect which allows you to darken or lighten the corners. Lightening the corners tends to be a relatively bad idea, and the reason for that is our eye is drawn to bright areas. So actually darkening down an image just a little bit at the edges will help hold your eye into the image and stop it wandering away. Can be overdone, again, one of those things that you need to be able to control and not go overboard with. Speaking of overboard, we spent all that time getting rid of the grain. There's also a way of putting it back in. There is one time that this putting grain back into an image is actually really useful, and that is if you're printing and you see bands on your print, particularly up here you may be able to see the banding. There shouldn't be any banding there, but if the compression or the printer ink doesn't have enough graduation, you sometimes see that banding. And the nice thing about adding the grain is it actually breaks up the banding line. Of course, you don't want to overdo it and put the grain on the faces, so it tends to be something you're not going to do in Camera Raw, but actually do in Photoshop, so that you can then mask out the areas that you don't want. And this is a post-crop vignette, which allows you to darken down your corners after you've done your cropping, and has a lot more control because you can shift the midpoint. Now, the easiest way of showing you that is to drop the feathering down and see the line and the edge of the vignette, and if you move the midpoint in and out, you can see that, and you can see how it changes with the roundness. So if you just want the corners darkened and nothing else, decrease the roundness, and you can see it's just taken the edge off those corners. There are specific settings that you can use for your camera calibration to get rid of some tints and issues that are known within the cameras, and then you can also import and save your own presets. There's an awful lot of capacity within Camera Raw, and we've kind of pretty much only just brushed the surface of it, but hopefully it gives you a starting point to be able to do some exploration. And there's graduated filters and radial filters and adjustment brushes, which we covered the adjustment brush very quickly, and I will let you go and have a play with them, because seriously the best way of getting your head around what these tools can do is go and use them. So get stuck in, and if you get stuck, give me a yell, or give your tutor a yell if I don't happen to be your tutor.